On a late-night stage built to make everyone look charming, one man tried to look impossible. Under the hot studio lights, Orson Welles stepped toward the desk, not like a guest, but like a magician claiming ownership of the room. Numbers flew. A chalkboard waited. The audience reacted in that specific American way, half laughter, half belief, until the trick began to feel too perfect, too fast, too clean. Johnny Carson didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply watched, smiling like a host, while calculating like a gatekeeper. And when the segment ended, something colder than embarrassment lingered. The sense that the show itself had been tested. How much power did a late-night host really have? And what happened to the stars who crossed a line nobody ever wrote down? In American late-night television, blacklisted was never a word you could point to. There was no memo, no announcement, no press conference. Yet everyone in the industry knew exactly what it meant when a guest stopped appearing. In the era ruled by Johnny Carson, absence itself became policy. If Carson did not invite you back to The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the rest of television understood the message without it ever being spoken. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was power operating efficiently. Before social media, before viral clips, late-night talk shows were the single most important gateway between celebrities and the American public. A strong Tonight Show appearance could sell books, revive albums, rescue films, or reframe a reputation overnight. The couch was not furniture. It was a cultural checkpoint. To lose access to it was to lose momentum in real time. What made the blacklist especially effective was its informality. Agents would pitch a guest. The booking department would hesitate. Not this cycle. Maybe later. Weeks passed. Then months. Eventually, the calls stopped. No one needed to say the word banned. In a tightly connected industry, silence traveled faster than explanation. A guest who disappeared from Carson's orbit was quietly labeled unpredictable, unsafe, or disloyal. 3 qualities late night could not afford. Talk shows marketed spontaneity, but behind the desk lived rigid control. Segments were timed to the second. Laughs were anticipated. Advertisers bought predictability. Hosts were trusted to manage the room, the guest, and the audience simultaneously. Any appearance that threatened that balance, whether through physical risk, functional breakdown, or humiliation of the host, was treated not as entertainment, but as operational failure. The blacklist also thrived because it avoided public conflict. Scandals invited debate. Silence ended it. A celebrity could not apologize on a stage they were no longer allowed to step onto. Without access, there was no opportunity to repair image, clarify intent, or regain trust. The system did not need to destroy reputations loudly. It only needed to stop amplifying them. In an era before digital alternatives, that quiet withdrawal functioned like a cultural off-switch. And once flipped, it was rarely turned back on. Late-night television never claimed to be a courtroom, but it operated like one. There were no written charges, no formal verdicts, and no appeals process. Yet careers were judged, weighed, and quietly dismissed based on a single question that mattered more than talent or fame. Can this person be trusted on live television? Trust in late night did not mean honesty or likability. It meant predictability. It meant that when the red light turned on, the guest would respect the invisible architecture holding the show together. That architecture was fragile. A live audience, a strict clock, advertisers paying for calm continuity, and a host whose authority had to remain absolute. Anyone who threatened that balance, even unintentionally, was no longer an asset. They were a risk. In 1987, Crispin Glover walked onto David Letterman's stage already labeled as unconventional. That label alone was not dangerous. Letterman's entire brand was built on awkwardness, irony, and guests who felt slightly off-center. Glover's posture, his tone, even his confrontational energy could have fit inside that ecosystem. What could not fit was what came next. As the interview drifted, Glover stood up, pivoted his body, and launched a high kick toward Letterman's face. The kick missed, but the damage was immediate. Letterman stood up not as a performer, but as a man protecting physical space. In that instant, the illusion of control shattered. From the couch, it may have looked like chaos flirting with comedy. From the control room, it looked like a safety breach. Live television has no tolerance for physical unpredictability. A guest who appears capable of violence, even symbolic violence, forces the network into legal, ethical, and financial danger. What mattered was not whether Glover intended harm, but that Letterman could no longer guarantee safety. And once a host loses that guarantee, the system responds without hesitation. There was no argument afterward. No public condemnation. Glover simply stopped appearing. The absence did the work. Agents understood. Bookers recalibrated. The message spread quietly. This guest disrupts control. In late night, that label is terminal. 7 years earlier, a different kind of disruption played out on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Truman Capote did not threaten the host's body. He threatened the clock. Capote arrived impaired by alcohol, medication, exhaustion, or all three. He slurred. He wandered. He failed to complete thoughts. Carson, a master technician of television, adjusted in real time. He simplified questions. He shortened answers. He tried to keep the segment moving. But the damage was already done. Late night forgives many things, but it does not forgive dead air. A guest who cannot communicate wastes the most valuable currency on television. Minutes. The difference between being high but functional and incapacitated is the difference between usable television and collapse. George Carlin could arrive altered and still deliver precision. Capote could not. The audience laughed nervously, sensing that something had gone wrong. And when the cameras cut to commercial, Capote's future on late night effectively ended. Carson never announced a ban. He did not need to. His silence was interpreted as instruction. In Carson's era, if you were no longer welcome on The Tonight Show, the rest of the industry followed suit. Not out of fear but alignment. Carson's judgment was treated as cultural consensus. If Glover violated physical safety and Capote violated functional discipline, Joan Rivers committed the most personal offense of all: betrayal of loyalty. Rivers was not just a frequent guest. She was Carson's chosen substitute host, entrusted with the desk itself. That trust came with an unwritten expectation, one never spoken aloud but universally understood. You do not surprise the king. When Rivers accepted a competing late-night show on Fox in 1986 without informing Carson beforehand, the act was interpreted not as ambition, but as treason. Carson reportedly learned of the deal through the press. In a system built on private understandings, that omission mattered more than contracts. Carson severed contact. Rivers was no longer welcome. And because Carson's influence extended beyond his own show, the silence followed her elsewhere. Rivers survived professionally. She reinvented herself repeatedly. But the cost was enduring. For decades, she spoke about the emotional damage of being cut off. Not because her career ended, but because the platform that had legitimized her was gone. The blacklist did not destroy her visibility. It erased her belonging. Then there is the case that crystallizes the deepest fear of late-night television: humiliation of the host. Orson Welles was not a reckless guest. He was a legend. But during one appearance on The Tonight Show, Welles allegedly staged a demonstration reading minds, solving numbers, with the assistance of planted audience members. Whether the story is fully accurate matters less than why it spread. The implication was devastating. The host had been made to look foolish on his own stage. Late night tolerates many sins. It does not tolerate being outsmarted in public. The host's authority is the spine of the show. If that authority cracks, everything downstream, laughter, trust, advertising, becomes unstable. After that appearance, Welles was reportedly never invited back. Again, no announcement, just absence. Across these cases, the pattern is unmistakable. The blacklist was not moral. It was operational. Safety, airtime discipline, loyalty, and host sovereignty formed the four pillars of late-night power. Break one and you might survive. Break more than one, and the system quietly closes its doors. What makes this system chilling is not its cruelty, but its efficiency. No confrontations. No apologies accepted. No redemption arc offered. Once trust was lost, access was revoked. And without access, a celebrity could not defend themselves, explain intent, or rewrite the narrative. They simply faded from the most powerful stage in American culture. To understand why blacklisting worked so thoroughly, you have to look at the men behind the desk, not as entertainers but as institutions. In late-night television's golden age, the host was not merely the face of the show. He was the show. And no one embodied that more completely than Johnny Carson. Carson's authority did not come from confrontation. Came from inevitability. For 3 decades, The Tonight Show was the final stop in American culture. Politicians, movie stars, authors, and comedians all passed through that studio with the same understanding. Approval here meant legitimacy everywhere else. When Carson stopped inviting someone back, it wasn't framed as punishment. It was treated as consensus. Networks aligned. Agents adapted. The industry moved on. Carson never had to raise his voice, because his silence carried more weight than any headline. What made Carson's power unique was its centralization. There were fewer platforms, fewer alternatives, and no digital escape routes. A guest who lost Carson lost the country. This allowed him to enforce unwritten rules without explanation. Respect the desk. Respect the clock. Respect the relationship. Break those rules and you did not get yelled at, you got replaced. David Letterman inherited a different landscape, but the core mechanism remained intact. Letterman cultivated discomfort, irony, and the feeling that anything could happen. His show welcomed awkwardness and rewarded unpredictability, up to the moment unpredictability threatened control. That is where the boundary hardened. Letterman allowed guests to be strange, but not dangerous. He allowed mockery, but not humiliation of the host. Crispin Glover crossed that line not because he was weird, but because he made the host stand up to protect himself. In late night, that visual alone redefined the guest from performer to liability. The difference between Carson and Letterman was not power, but style. Carson ruled like a monarch. Letterman ruled like a curator of chaos. Both relied on the same enforcement tool: access. Carson removed access through paternal distance. Letterman removed it through professional recalibration. The result was identical. The guest disappeared. By the time late night entered the modern era, the monopoly weakened. Cable networks multiplied. Streaming fractured audiences. Social media allowed celebrities to speak directly to fans without waiting for an invitation. A guest banned from one show could appear on another, start a podcast, or reframe a scandal online within hours. The blacklist lost its ability to suffocate completely. But it did not vanish. It evolved. Modern cancel culture is louder and faster, but often shorter-lived. Outrage spikes, then fades. In contrast, the old late-night blacklist was quiet and durable. It did not demand public agreement. It simply withdrew oxygen and waited. This raises an uncomfortable question. Would Johnny Carson's silence still work today? Probably not with the same force. But in his era, and even into Letterman's, the host's control over access meant control over narrative. And narrative, more than truth or talent, determined who stayed visible. The stage changed. The desk changed. The audience changed. But the principle remained the same. In late night, power belonged to whoever controlled who got to sit down. The most damaging part of a talk show blacklist was never the night it happened. It was the years that followed, shaped by absence rather than outrage. Careers did not always collapse. Many of the people quietly erased from late night continued to work, continued to earn, continued to exist. But they did so without the one tool that allowed celebrities to redefine themselves in the public imagination: controlled visibility. For Crispin Glover, the disappearance from late night froze his image in time. Without follow-up appearances, without chances to contextualize his behavior, the 1987 incident became his defining television moment. He was no longer an actor who happened to be eccentric. He was that guest. Glover continued making films, often on the margins, but his relationship with mainstream television never fully recovered. The blacklist did not destroy his career. It narrowed it. Truman Capote's fate was more fragile. By 1980, television was one of the last remaining bridges between his literary legacy and a mass audience. When that bridge closed, there was nothing to replace it. Capote's work remained celebrated, but his presence disappeared. Without late night, he lost the ability to be seen as alive rather than archived. The blacklist did not erase his talent. It erased his relevance in real time. Joan Rivers represents the most complicated aftermath. She fought her way back into public life through relentless reinvention, stand-up, fashion television, reality media. Yet for decades, she remained separated from the ecosystem that had first validated her. Rivers spoke openly about the pain of being cut off from Johnny Carson, not because she lacked success, but because she had lost her place at the table that defined legitimacy. When she finally returned to The Tonight Show in 2014, long after Carson's death, the moment felt less like forgiveness than closure. The silence had already shaped the story. Orson Welles suffered a different kind of consequence: mythologization. The story of him outsmarting Johnny Carson became a cautionary tale repeated in whispers. Whether fully accurate or not, the rumor itself was enough to mark him as a risk. Welles continued to be revered as a genius, but increasingly framed as unmanageable. The blacklist worked not by proving guilt, but by letting suspicion linger unchallenged. Across all these cases, one truth emerges. The late-night blacklist did not end lives. It redirected them. It removed the right to respond. And in an industry where narrative is everything, losing that right was often more damaging than any scandal could ever be. Late-night television has always presented itself as a place of redemption. A couch, a desk, a host's smile. An invitation to explain yourself, to be forgiven, to start again. But behind that promise sat a quieter truth. Late night was never built to rescue people. It was built to protect itself. The stories of Crispin Glover, Truman Capote, Joan Rivers, and Orson Welles are not morality tales. They are case studies in how power maintains order without ever raising its voice. No bans were announced. No careers were officially ended. The system simply withdrew access and waited. In Hollywood, that kind of silence is not neutral. It shapes memory. It decides who gets context and who gets reduced to a single moment. Scandals explode and fade. Apologies trend and disappear. But silence endures. It denies the chance to respond, to evolve, to be seen again on equal footing. And in the pre-social media era, when late-night television controlled the most important gateway to public legitimacy, losing that access was often irreversible. These stories force an uncomfortable question. Who really controls culture? The stars who perform, or the gatekeepers who decide when the cameras stop rolling? If you believe fame is fragile, these stories explain why. If you believe power prefers quiet solutions, these stories prove it. Subscribe for more cinematic investigations into the hidden rules of American television. And comment below. Do you think these bans were justified, or were they quiet abuses of power?